who knew that I was.
The sound of a slap echoed across the studio. It wasn't part of the script. The crew froze. No one dared to breathe. The camera kept rolling, capturing a silence so sharp it seemed to cut through the air itself. Meryl Streep stood still, her cheek burning red, her eyes wide with disbelief. Opposite her, Dustin Hoffman, Hollywood's most celebrated actor of the moment, didn't break character. He had just struck his co-star for real. The year was 1978. Meryl was 29, new to Hollywood, fragile with grief. Only months earlier, she had buried the man she loved, John Cazale, who died of cancer before their wedding. Her heart was still broken when she accepted the role of Joanna Kramer, a woman fighting to keep her son after a brutal divorce. It was the role that would define her. But behind the camera, it would also destroy something inside her. Dustin Hoffman was a method actor, one of the legends who believed that truth in performance came only from real pain. That day, without warning, he decided to turn fiction into reality. He slapped Meryl Streep across the face to wake up the emotion. That was real, she said years later. Her voice calm but cold. It wasn't acting. It was violence disguised as art. Audiences wept when Kramer vs. Kramer was released. They called it a masterpiece of realism. A portrait of heartbreak so authentic, it felt like life itself. What they didn't know was that the realism came from a woman reliving her own trauma, forced to cry. Not for a character, but for herself. For decades, Meryl stayed silent. She became Hollywood's great lady, collecting awards, commanding respect, never mentioning what had happened on that set. But time has a way of unearthing buried truths. In a quiet interview, 40 years later, a journalist asked, "Is there a scene you can't forget?" She paused for a long time, then answered softly, "The slap. In Kramer vs. Kramer." The room went still. Because in that moment, one of Hollywood's most sacred myths, that pain makes great art, began to crack. And beneath it, a haunting question lingered. Can art still be called truth when it wounds the person who creates it? In 1979, Kramer vs. Kramer premiered to thunderous applause. The story of a man and a woman fighting over their child after a painful divorce struck a chord across the world. The performances were hailed as breathtakingly real. Critics wrote that Dustin Hoffman had never been better. Meryl Streep, they said, was a revelation. On the surface, the film looked like a triumph, an artistic collaboration between two giants at the height of their craft. But behind that golden image, behind the awards and the standing ovations, a quiet war had been raging from the very first day of filming. For Meryl, Kramer vs. Kramer wasn't just another role. It was survival. Hollywood was still a man's empire in the late 70s, loud, competitive, unapologetically ruled by male directors and actors. A young woman on set was expected to be silent, grateful, and accommodating, especially when standing opposite a star like Dustin Hoffman. Hoffman was already a legend. The Graduate, Midnight Cowboy, Lenny, each film had cemented his reputation as one of the greatest actors alive. He was intense, unpredictable, and utterly committed to the truth of the scene. To many, he was a genius. To those who worked closely with him, he could also be terrifying. On the first day of Kramer vs. Kramer, Meryl arrived with her script marked with notes, small, handwritten reminders of emotional beats, quiet gestures. She was known for her precision, for her belief that empathy, not aggression, brought truth to a performance. But Hoffman worked differently. He believed in chaos, in confrontation, in pushing his partners to the edge of emotional breakdown. Crew members would later say that every day on that set felt like walking a tightrope between brilliance and cruelty. Hoffman often stayed in character between takes, arguing, mocking, sometimes even provoking his co-stars just to keep the energy alive. Meryl became his main target. He would interrupt her lines, challenge her choices, even insult her off-camera to build tension for the next scene. Some thought it was just his method. Others saw it for what it was, control. Yet, when the camera rolled, their chemistry was undeniable. The friction between them gave life to something electric. Meryl's quiet fury, Dustin's desperate vulnerability. It felt unbearably real because it was. The director, Robert Benton, once said, "They gave me gold. I just tried to stay out of their way." But even he admitted later that he didn't always know what was happening when the camera stopped. During one particularly emotional scene, the courtroom sequence, Meryl was supposed to plead for her son's custody. Torn between love and guilt, Hoffman sat across from her, his eyes sharp, unreadable. Minutes before filming, he leaned in and whispered something cruel. No one knows exactly what he said. But when the scene began, Meryl's tears came not from acting, they came from something deeper, rawer. The pain on her face was too real. When Kramer versus Kramer was released, that very scene made her a star. She won her first Oscar for it, Best Supporting Actress. She thanked the director, her colleagues, and the power of storytelling. She didn't mention Dustin Hoffman. To the public, it looked like creative tension, the classic clash of two great artists. But to Meryl, it was something else entirely, the price of being a woman in a world that equated cruelty with genius. Years later, she revealed that Hoffman had crossed boundaries that no one should ever cross on a set. He had taunted her about her late partner, touched her without consent, and treated her pain as raw material for his performance. It was the 70s. She said, and people thought that was how you got realism. In interviews, Hoffman downplayed the stories. He said he only wanted the film to feel honest, that he admired Meryl deeply. But for Meryl, admiration wasn't the point. She had entered that project believing that art could heal her, that by playing a woman losing everything, she could somehow reclaim her own voice after loss. Instead, she found herself fighting for dignity in front of an entire crew. Yet even through the turmoil, she delivered something extraordinary. Her portrayal of Joanna Kramer, quiet, conflicted, misunderstood, became a turning point for how Hollywood wrote women. She was not a villain, nor a victim. She was human. It was the performance of a lifetime, one born not from collaboration, but from resistance. Behind the cameras, the contrast was brutal. Hoffman basked in the film's success, joking in interviews, "I just gave her something to react to." Meryl, on the other hand, avoided talking about it altogether. She smiled politely, deflecting questions, refusing to feed the gossip. She had learned something that many women in Hollywood already knew. Silence was sometimes the only protection you had. But silence also has a cost. For years, the story of Kramer versus Kramer was told as a triumph of realism, the film that showed divorce and parenthood as they really were. What no one asked was whose truth it was built on. Meryl's performance became a mirror of her own life, a woman judged, doubted, yet unyielding. The critics called her the voice of reason, the soul of the story. But when she returned home each night, she felt drained, hollow. She wasn't sure if she had been acting or surviving. In later years, when she finally spoke about it, her words were simple, but devastating. Sometimes people forget that actors are human. We don't have to be broken to make something true. The world applauded Kramer versus Kramer as a masterpiece. It won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. The headlines praised Hoffman and Streep for their intense, creative bond. But the truth was far less romantic. What the audience saw as passion was, in reality, the reflection of a battle, a struggle for respect, for autonomy, for the right to be seen as an equal. It was not the story of a perfect partnership. It was the story of 2 different kinds of power colliding. One born from dominance, the other from endurance. And though the camera stopped rolling decades ago, that tension, that invisible scar between them never really disappeared. For Meryl, Kramer versus Kramer became both her breakthrough and her wound. The film that made her immortal and taught her how lonely greatness could be. Fame is often described as light, a brightness that exposes everything. But for Meryl Streep, fame began in darkness. After Kramer versus Kramer, she was everywhere: magazine covers, talk shows, red carpets, film festivals. The world fell in love with her calm poise, her sharp intelligence, her ability to inhabit emotion without losing control. They called her the thinking man's actress, the new face of integrity in Hollywood. But what they never saw was the quiet recoil in her eyes every time someone mentioned the film that made her famous. Behind closed doors, Meryl carried a silent contradiction: gratitude for the success, and shame for what it had cost. Every award, every interview, every encore applause carried the same undertone. Was this what John would have wanted for me? Was this what art was supposed to be? In the early years after Kramer versus Kramer, she often avoided talking about her process. While other actors boasted of method, Meryl stayed private. Her technique was empathy, not imitation, not torture, not pain. But she had learned, through one devastating experience, that Hollywood worshipped pain. Producers began to treat her differently. She was no longer just talented, she was marketable. Studios sent her scripts filled with weeping women, fragile wives, grieving mothers. They wanted the Meryl Streep tears the quiet kind that looked beautiful even in suffering. And so the cycle began. Her next films, The French Lieutenant's Woman, Sophie's Choice, Silkwood, all asked her to reopen the same wound in new ways. To cry again, to suffer again, to embody the woman destroyed by love or loss. Each time, critics praised her for her realism, her emotional precision. Each time, Meryl wondered if she was slowly disappearing inside her own craft. She once told a close friend, "They say I am fearless, but I am not. I just know what it's like to be afraid and keep working anyway." When she shot Sophie's Choice in 1982, she revisited that same emotional territory: trauma, guilt, survival. But this time, she was in control. She shaped the pain. She didn't let it shape her. Yet even then, on some nights, she woke up drenched in sweat, hearing echoes of that slap, the one that started it all. People often describe Kramer versus Kramer as a story about love and divorce. But for Meryl, it was about something deeper: boundaries. It was the moment she realized that in Hollywood, a woman's pain could be turned into profit, packaged and sold as authenticity. In interviews, She often smiled when asked about her chemistry with Dustin Hoffman. Her answers were always measured, almost clinical. "We work differently," she would say. It was a challenge. That was her language for war: polite, restrained, surgical. Hoffman, meanwhile, continued to defend his methods. In later documentaries, he said he had pushed Meryl because she was too perfect, too composed. He wanted to break her surface. He never understood that she wasn't hiding, she was protecting. Meryl never called him out directly. She didn't need to. Her silence was eloquent enough. When the Me Too movement exploded decades later, journalists asked her again about that time. She didn't dwell on it. She only said, "We didn't have the words back then. We just had the work. And sometimes, the work was all you could use to survive." For her, that survival became an art form. Instead of rage, she chose transformation. Each role after Kramer versus Sen, Kramer became a piece of quiet revenge, a reclaiming of power through subtlety, intelligence, and moral strength. But even strength can be lonely. After long days on set, Meryl would return home, remove her makeup, and sit alone in front of the mirror. She often said she had to find her own face again after filming. The mirror didn't always recognize her. It was during one of those nights, after winning her second Oscar, that she finally broke down. Not from joy, but from exhaustion. She looked at the golden statue and thought, if they only knew what it really took to get here. To the world, she was a symbol of excellence. To herself, she was still that young woman on set, frozen, humiliated, but refusing to cry until the camera stopped. Her friend said that Meryl rarely spoke about anger. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, the responsibility of an artist not to exploit emotion, but to elevate it. She became a mentor for younger actresses, warning them about the fine line between emotional truth and personal violation. "You can give everything to a performance," she once said, "but never give yourself away." That line, quiet, almost whispered, carried the weight of a lifetime, because she knew what it meant to give yourself away. In private, she sometimes rewatched Kramer versus Kramer, not as nostalgia, but as confrontation. She said she wanted to see what the camera saw that day and what it didn't. There's a moment in the film, right before her character leaves her husband, when Meryl glances toward the window. It's only a few seconds, but her eyes shift not as Joanna Kramer, but as Meryl Streep herself. The look of someone realizing that truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes, it just brands you forever. Over time, she learned to forgive without forgetting. When asked about Hoffman in later years, she said only this: "He was a brilliant actor and a complicated man. We all were." That was her way of closing the chapter gracefully, but firmly. And yet, the emotional residue of that time lingered in her work. In The Iron Lady, she played Margaret Thatcher with the fragility of a woman trapped inside her own myth. In doubt, she captured moral conviction trembling under fear. And in The Post, decades later, she played a woman finally finding her voice in a man's world. Every role was a reflection of that first lesson, that truth without respect is just another form of violence. Meryl Streep's genius has often been described as empathy made visible. But empathy, she once said, isn't softness, it's precision. It's the willingness to see. And that willingness was born from pain, from a moment when someone tried to turn her humanity into performance. And she refused to let them. In a later essay about women in film, she wrote, We live in a world that mistakes domination for strength. But real power is quiet. It doesn't need to wound to exist. That sentence could have been about acting or about life. It was, in truth, about both. Because behind every frame of Kramer versus Kramer, behind every tear that audiences praised, was a hidden truth that the woman on screen wasn't just performing sorrow. She was remembering it. And in doing so, she transformed pain into empathy, humiliation into mastery, silence into art. Meryl once said that acting, for her, was never about pretending. It was about borrowing someone's heart for a while and giving it back intact. But after Kramer versus Kramer, she realized something even deeper. Sometimes, the heart you borrow is your own. For nearly 40 years, Meryl Streep never spoke publicly about what happened on that set. She built an empire of grace and brilliance, 30-plus Oscar nominations, universal respect, the rare kind of fame untouched by scandal. But beneath the calm surface, the question always lingered in whispers. What really happened between her and Dustin Hoffman during Kramer vs. 1? Kramer, asterisk. Then, one afternoon in 2018, during a quiet interview about the changing culture in Hollywood, the journalist asked her again the same question that had followed her for decades. Meryl hesitated. Her voice was soft, her tone measured, but there was no longer a need to hide. "He crossed the line," she said. "He hurt me. I think he thought it was part of the work, but it wasn't." The words landed like thunder, not shouted, but devastating in their restraint. It was not an accusation born of bitterness. It was truth spoken without fear. The woman who had once endured humiliation in silence was now powerful enough to name it. The shock was not that Hoffman had gone too far. It was that the industry, the directors, the crew, the system itself had watched it happen and called it art. In that moment, something in the mythology of Hollywood cracked open. The era of the method genius, the culture of male authority disguised as creativity, suddenly looked archaic. What had once been admired as intensity now appeared for what it was, abuse hidden behind applause. Reporters flooded her with questions, desperate for details. But Meryl didn't give them what they wanted. She refused to turn pain into spectacle. She simply said, "I've forgiven him." But forgiveness doesn't erase what it teaches you. That sentence carried more power than any revelation could. Because what she had learned and what she forced the world to confront was that art built on someone's suffering is never truly beautiful. In private, she later described what that forgiveness meant. It wasn't reconciliation. She and Hoffman were never close again. It was acceptance of what happened, of who she had become because of it. She said, "If I stay angry, it means he still owns that moment. I'd rather own it myself." That choice, calm instead of fury, stunned people even more than the confession itself. In a culture addicted to outrage, Meryl Streep chose dignity. But her revelation did something larger than vindicate herself. It reframed a generation's idea of what acting meant. Young actresses began to quote her in workshops, "Realism doesn't have to hurt." Directors started asking before pushing. The language of consent entered the rehearsal room. Slowly, quietly, her voice changed the way an entire industry worked. Hoffman never directly responded, but those close to him said he was shaken. He had built his legacy on truth at all costs. Now the cost had a name. Friends said that years later. When asked about Meryl, he grew quiet and said only, "She was the bravest partner I ever had. I just didn't know it then. The irony was brutal. The man who once treated her pain as a tool ended up defined by her courage. Meryl rarely spoke of him again. She didn't need to. Her silence, this time, was not fear. It was sovereignty. When Kramer vs. Z. Kramer was re-released for its 40th anniversary, critics watched it differently. They still admired the performances, but they saw the subtext, the real tension, the unspoken violence beneath the tenderness. They saw a young woman learning to survive in front of the camera, transforming humiliation into empathy, control into truth. And perhaps that is why the film still feels so alive. Because what we are watching is not just fiction, it's a record of resistance. The biggest shock was never the slap, or the cruelty, or the confession. It was the realization that the most authentic performance in Hollywood's history was born not from method acting, but from a woman's quiet refusal to break. Meryl Streep didn't just act pain, she transformed it into understanding. She didn't just forgive, she redefined what power looks like when it refuses to humiliate. In her final reflection on the incident, she said something that sounded almost like poetry. Art should move people. Yes, but it should never wound the people who make it. Those words became her legacy, and perhaps the truest moral of Kramer vs. S. Kramer. Because beyond the applause, beyond the golden trophies and immortal lines, the real story was not about a divorce or a custody battle. It was about the invisible cost of beauty, the price of turning real tears into entertainment. And in the end, the woman who was once struck for truth became the voice that finally defined it. Time has a way of softening the edges of even the sharpest wounds. But some truths never fade, they simply find a quieter place to live. For Meryl Streep, that place was art. Every role she played after Kramer vs. Kramer carried a trace of what she learned there, the strength to feel deeply without surrendering herself. She turned vulnerability into discipline, empathy into armor. And through her, millions of women saw that dignity could coexist with pain, that silence could be more powerful than rage. Hollywood, too, began to change. The myth of the tortured male genius started to crumble. Younger filmmakers began to ask different questions, not how real can we make it, but at what cost? Meryl never led marches or shouted slogans. She simply kept working, showing that mastery could come from gentleness, that greatness did not need cruelty to exist. Looking back, she once said, "Every time I step in front of a camera, I remember who I was when I started and what I promised myself it'd never become." It was not revenge. It was redemption through craft, through the quiet insistence that truth and respect belong in the same breath. In the story of Kramer vs. Kramer, a woman walks away from her family to find her voice. In life, Meryl Streep did something far more difficult. She stayed inside an industry that had hurt her and changed it from within. That is the paradox of her legacy. The same film that wounded her also became the foundation of her power. What began as humiliation turned into history. And what once silenced her became the reason others learned to speak. When asked, decades later, if she would ever erase that experience if she could, she smiled and said, "No, because it taught me the difference between pain and truth." And maybe that is the final moral of her story. That art, at its best, is not born from suffering, but from the courage to transform it.